Penn Badgley's ex-girlfriend is at it again. Hola, my fam. It is Perez, the queen of all media, the original influencer, and your number one source for everything It Ends With Us saga. This is like caffeine for me. Un cafecito. So rico. A new filing from Darth Lively alleges that Baldoni and the Wayfarer defendants had an obligation to preserve communications amongst themselves, and they purposefully didn't. So, the baby bump bruja is now going for sanctions. Again. The judge has yet to rule on any of Team Ridicula's prior requests for sanctions or attorney's fees, but hey, I'm not mad at this. I'm glad. Kaka's legal teams are building nice pools and doing renovations to their homes thanks to Ryan Reynolds' money. The lawyers are the real winners here. Cozy on up. Let's get into this together. Our girl ethically challenged Ezra Hudson wrote this. You have been warned. It is by now well known that defendants texted and emailed each other about their inability to execute an untraceable retaliatory campaign against Blake Lively that would leave no fingerprints. Pause. So Ezra just admitted that the retaliatory smear campaign is traceable? All right, babe, bring on the receipts. Where's your proof? Screenshots, timeline. Show me the evidence. 'Cause so far, where is it? Ezra continues, their defense from the outset has been that they never moved beyond the scenario planning stage, which was a blueprint intended to bury Miss Lively and her career. Along with their counsel, they have mocked Miss Lively's use of the term untraceable, even though it was first used by defendant Nathan in stressing the importance of leaving no paper trail. And they have routinely taunted that Miss Lively will not be able to prove that defendants actually implemented the retaliatory campaign, probably because they didn't. Insisting that the sudden onslaught of negative publicity against her beginning in August 2024 was organic, coinciding perfectly with their plans by sheer luck. Meanwhile, defendants have hid the ball at every turn in the discovery process, either failing to produce documents or improperly cloaking them in the attorney-client privilege, forcing no less than 12 discovery-related motions to date against defendants and their aligned third parties. Now that the dust has settled and fact discovery and depositions have closed, two things are clear. One, despite defendants' clumsy efforts to cover their tracks, there is substantial evidence that the retaliatory campaign was in fact implemented and planned. I can't wait to read the rest of this and see what comes out at trial, if we get to trial. Remember, the queen of misrepresentation and her attorneys like to spin things. It's not always what they seem, if we are to believe them. And two, ethically challenged Ezra says, defendants flouted this court's orders and destroyed and or failed to preserve or produce additional material and highly relevant evidence, the absence of which they intend to try to unjustly exploit in their favor. Miss Lively brings this motion to stop defendants from benefiting from their own misconduct as described below. Christmas again. First, defendants used ephemeral methods of communication, thereby destroying and or failing to preserve relevant communications in real time. In their depositions, most of the defendants admitted, then redacted, including as early as July. The evidence further shows that Mr. Wallace redacted at the height of their discussions of a retaliatory campaign. Pause. I know some of you don't want to hear this, but I still think they're going to settle. And once again, the former Dragon Keeper and her lawyers are doing what they so often accuse the other side of. PR. Playing the game. Optics. Perhaps purposefully over-redacting so that the public and the press would get their brains spinning and theories working. All, thus far, alleged. Just because they say something doesn't mean it's true. They continue. Indeed, this court has already recognized that it is undisputed that the Wayfarer parties used Signal to discuss topics relevant to this litigation. Is that illegal? I don't know if it is. Are you a lawyer? Do you know? Do you work in the legal field? Let us all know in the comments section. This is what I was able to find on my own. And even though I'm in my Elle Woods era, I am not a lawyer. A little research says that once you reasonably anticipate litigation, meaning you know you are about to sue someone or be sued, you have an affirmative legal duty to preserve all potentially relevant evidence. This duty applies to everyone involved in the lawsuit, plaintiffs and defendants. So, as we heard in that secret recording that has now been unsealed, Steve Sarowitz, the co-founder of Wayfarer, said on August 29th, I believe that recording was made, that he anticipated litigation, was hoping to avoid it, but at that point, it was a possibility. But that would mean that any communications in July or maybe even early or through mid-August, Signal chats are safe, right? I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. And ultimately, her bestie, Judge Lyman, is the one who would decide all of this. Accordingly, the court previously ordered the Wayfarer defendants to produce their Signal communications, including those of their counsel, by September 8th, 2025. They not only failed to timely produce all responsive communications, but none of the defendants ever produced any Signal communications predating December 20th, 2024. Pause. They're going to argue, most likely, and it will be a bold argument, because we've now heard Steve Sarowitz say that a lawsuit was a possibility and that their lawyers were on standby and were ready. Remember that? I played you the audio in full. My expert analysis is they're going to say, oh, we didn't suspect anything until the California Civil Rights Department complaint. And that was filed right around December 20th. Months later. Not one Signal communication predating December 20th. They say, for the Wallace defendants, the reason for this is clear. they admitted to the court that they did not disable the auto-delete function on Signal, even though Signal was their preferred method of communication for work. Wait, I'm confused. How does that make any sense? Jed Wallace did not disable auto-delete, so then he strategically just did not hand over any communications? Wow. Bold. Y'all, I've said this repeatedly. I'm team truth. I'm not saying what she's alleging is the truth, but I have to consider it, okay? If this is true, that's wild. The remaining defendants cannot explain their failure to preserve or produce relevant Signal communications or voice memos from Mr. Wallace prior to December 20th, 2024. But it is clear that the messages are destroyed and cannot be replaced. There's also a footnote here. None of the defendants produced a single voice memo from Mr. Wallace at any time prior to December 20th, 2024, including Mr. Wallace. Notably, however, Catherine Case, of Case and Coslow infamy, did produce one voice memo from Mr. Wallace dated August 5th, 2024, in her third-party production. Redacted. And they add, for his part, Mr. Baldoni claims, redacted. They continue, this fact about the voice memos and Signal chats being destroyed, this fact is all the more damning given that the Wayfarer defendant's lead attorney, Brian Friedman, was a participant on at least some Signal communications with the defendants by August 2024, and yet apparently did nothing to ensure these communications were preserved. Defendants further contemplated litigation as early as August 2024, although the evidence shows that most of them were clearly aware of the possibility of legal action by November 2023, yet took no steps whatsoever to preserve their Signal or voice memo communications until December 20th, 2024. Incredibly, Mr. Baldoni testified that, redacted. Second, defendants produced no documents and provided minimal testimony about the work they claim the Wallace defendants actually performed for their $90,000 fee in 2024, as to which defendants either feigned ignorance or described with one word, monitoring. No one, however, including Mr. Wallace, has been able to explain what monitoring actually involved. And more importantly, not a single pre-December 20th, 2024 document has been produced either, one, backing up the defendant's claim that all the Wallace defendants did was monitor, or two, reflecting the supposed monitoring work that was performed. In defendant's entire document production, there are no reports, text messages, notes, or email summaries reflecting this alleged social media monitoring work from August 2024. Having retained the Wallace defendants to perform a detailed set of untraceable digital services, paid the Wallace defendants $90,000 over a period of 3 months for these services, and communicated with the Wallace defendants through ephemeral communications intended to eliminate any digital trail, defendants now hope to blame Miss Lively for being hindered in her ability to present the specific direct evidence they destroyed. But as described in more detail below, there is substantial evidence that defendants indeed engaged in the conduct detailed in their scenario planning documents and did exactly what the Wallace defendants and Tagg proposed to do. The digital campaign as defined specifically below, which is entirely consistent with redacted. Given the foregoing, severe sanctions are warranted to prevent defendants from benefiting from their willful misconduct, to remedy the prejudice caused by the spoliated evidence. Miss Lively respectfully seeks, can't wait to see what this is, 1, an adverse inference that defendants intentionally deleted and failed to preserve relevant evidence when they had an obligation to do so, and that the destroyed evidence would have further shown defendants' execution of the digital campaign. 2, preclusion sanctions to prevent defendants from this is big. Whoa, this is why we read everything. Oh my God. Preclusion sanctions to prevent defendants from arguing that they did not execute their digital campaign as they openly planned to do, or that the Wallace defendants did not actually engage in the digital campaign services they were hired and paid to perform, given the destruction of documentary evidence that would otherwise show that the Wallace defendants actually did. Pause. I need lawyers to help. Because what basically is being asked is for the judge to be the jury now. Seems like the whole untraceable part is gonna be decided before trial? My head hurts. I mean, I guess maybe, I don't know. The judge has determined a lot of matters of fact up until now, or alleged fact, or procedure. And 3, monetary sanctions, at least in the amount of Miss Lively's reasonable attorney's fees and costs for bringing this motion. Now we get to the nitty-gritty. They claim that return to work letter should have put them on notice that a lawsuit could have happened. Certain Wayfarer defendants acknowledged receipt of a legal letter on or about November 9th, 2023, triggering an obligation to preserve evidence. On November 9th, 2023, prior to returning to production on the film It Ends With Us, the film, which had been halted between June and October 2023 due to the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild strikes, Miss Lively's attorney sent Wayfarer's attorney a document entitled Protections for Return to Production. In the underlying transmittal email, Miss Lively's attorney explained that the purpose of the protections document was to ensure that Miss Lively and others feel safe returning to the production, and further warned Wayfarer's attorney that if production is unwilling to accept or uphold these protections, our client is prepared to pursue her full legal rights and remedies. Okay. Seems like a fair, valid point. They were on notice in November 2023. The anxiety this is giving me all. And me having this anxiety, I often think of how Baldoni and the Wayfarer defendants must be feeling. And for how long this has all been going on. Their request for sanctions continues. Mr. Baldoni and the Wayfarer defendants who received the document, redacted, text messages dated November 11th, 2023, from Mr. Baldoni to Mr. Heath and Mr. Sarowitz remove any doubt as to their understanding. Redacted. Mr. Heath testified that he understood this document. Redacted. Look. These redactions are all their choosing. I don't believe they were forced to redact any of this by the judge. Once again, all you legal eagles, I need your input. Why so many redactions? I gave a theory earlier, which is optics, but I'm trying to think, what could some other possible reasons be? Why so many redactions? They continue. Later, Mr. Heath took active steps to prepare for such litigation. Redacted. This is really confusing because I don't know what was just said, but that same day, June 17th, 2024, Mr. Baldoni asked for the recommendation of redacted, to which Miss Abel suggested redacted. Okay, all right. This seems pretty obvious what the redacted information was. Baldoni asked for the recommendation of a lawyer, to which Abel suggested a lawyer. Why would you redact that? I mean, I could be wrong. It could be something else, but it seems like that. Why would you redact the... Sorry. Let us continue. Defendants decide to blank, redacted, against Miss Lively in August 2024. Since at least early August 2024, defendants have engaged in a retaliatory campaign against Miss Lively designed to bury and destroy her career. Among other things, defendants' planned digital efforts have included amplifying or boosting trends or narratives that are favorable to Mr. Baldoni, or to manufacture and perpetuate negative narratives about Miss Lively. Then they include some exhibit that is, I guess, from the Heath deposition. Fudge. Good news and bad news. That was not from the Heath deposition, Jamie Heath, Baldoni's producing partner. That was from an email. It is exhibit number 24. That email is a nothing burger. That email said, "This is everything that Jed Wallace could do. Let me show you." We've seen this before. We don't need to rehash all of this. Monitor, narrative, leverage relationships with social media, blah, 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 blah. We've seen this. Remember, the social team are now worried about Blake activating the Taylor Swift fan base. And then they ask for more money. Nothing new here. And unfortunately, of the 55 exhibits that were included with this motion for sanctions, I would say like 90% of them were filed under seal. I'm doing a quick glance. Almost every single exhibit was filed under seal, meaning we can't see. Great. Strategic. They continue. Fearing that Mr. Baldoni and Mr. Heath's misconduct on the set of the film would become public as the film's August 9th release date neared, on or about August 3rd, 2024, Wayfarer retained TAG as a crisis PR firm to prepare to discredit Miss Lively in the court of public opinion, should she dare tell the truth about what happened. To that end, on August 2nd, 2024, TAG developed a document entitled Scenario Planning, plainly already anticipating litigation. As part of this initiative, TAG anticipated working with legal to provide information to ensure Wayfarer and Baldoni's narrative is properly represented in any and all coverage. In terms of messaging, TAG took aim at Miss Lively directly. One of the key messaging points included highlighting Miss Lively's less than favorable reputation in the industry spans decades and has been reported. Smart. When Mr. Baldoni expressed concern that this document seemed less aggressive than what TAG had conveyed to him over the phone, Miss Nathan admitted to Miss Abel that the scenario planning document was deliberately written that way because of the danger of recording their true intentions in writing. Shortly after her first conversation with Wayfarer, Miss Nathan reached out to the Wallace defendants, TAG's regular collaborators, and shared details of Miss Lively's protections document on August 5th. Realizing they needed an experienced social media manipulator on or about August 7th, due to the uptick in social chatter, TAG recommended retaining, and Wayfarer did retain the Wallace defendants for a rate of $30,000 per month. TAG employee Katie Case detailed the Wallace defendants' services with bullet points in the August 7th proposal, which Miss Lively refers to throughout this motion as the digital campaign. More like proposed digital campaign. More like possible digital campaign. The Baldoni and Wayfarer crew allege that they were planned and prepared for that, but they didn't actually follow through with all of that. In this proposal, good, they're calling it a proposal. That's what it is. Miss Case, she just outed herself. Sometimes you unintentionally slip up. In this proposal, Miss Case took care to note that the integral part here is to execute all without fingerprints, demonstrating that the decision to conduct business with no paper trail, including via the use of ephemeral messaging capabilities for digital services, was not an accident, but rather the plan all along. That plan has enabled defendants to hide, in part, how they implemented the digital campaign against Miss Lively. Documents produced during discovery pursuant to court orders, however, show that TAG and Wallace are not only capable of implementing the above social manipulation tactics, but that they have done so redacted. Those documents include, for example, discussions of redacted. Mr. Wallace requesting client call to redacted. Mr. Wallace expressing the need to redacted. Wallace saying to client redacted and asking this client redacted. When confronted with these documents in his deposition, Mr. Wallace redacted. By no later than August 12, 2024, defendants took the offensive. Using their own words, it was time to lawyer up, get redacted and redacted. Even though defendants touted their use of clandestine tactics to avoid leaving any fingerprints, they were not entirely successful and still managed to leave a significant paper trail that evidences their extensive efforts to engage in a retaliatory campaign. See Exhibit 55. At 6-29, Miss Lively's 23-plus page interrogatory response summarizing and consolidating the evidence demonstrating some of defendants' conduct directed at Miss Lively. Exhibit 55 is filed under seal. For example, they continue, consistent with the scenario planning document's key messaging points, defendants were strategic and deliberate in successfully planting seeds of doubt and speculation about Miss Lively's experience on set, amplifying positive narratives about Mr. Baldoni designed to provide a contrast with negative messaging regarding Miss Lively and amplifying negative stories and content focusing on Miss Lively. Following the early August scenario planning, defendants began communicating through Signal and, as for Mr. Wallace, voice memos, which are the focal point of this motion. Defendants used ephemeral communications as early as August 2024, consistent with their efforts to run an untraceable campaign with no fingerprints. Defendants communicated frequently through Signal, an encrypted messaging platform that features auto-deletion capabilities and voice memos that delete automatically unless saved by the recipient. Redacted. Just days later, on August 10th, Mr. Heath emailed Mr. Wallace to redacted. 2 days later, the tag defendants started a new Signal thread with Wallace, just in case they needed Wallace to connect them with Brian Friedman, because they're very close. Acknowledging that redacted, later in this text thread, Miss Nathan instructed Miss Abel to definitely contact Mr. Friedman on Signal. Documents from this same period, August 2024, also confirm that Mr. Wallace communicated redacted. At his deposition, Mr. Heath confirmed redacted. Both Miss Nathan and Miss Abel admitted to redacted. In addition, after Miss Lively filed her complaint with the California Civil Rights Department, the CRD complaint, and served defendants with cease and desist letters on December 20th, 2024, TAG created a new Signal chat, redacted. The very next day, TAG started a new Signal thread with redacted. In a separate text chain that same day, redacted. Even since the filing of this action, defendants have continued to use Signal and, as for Mr. Wallace, voice memos to communicate covertly about their ongoing retaliation against Miss Lively. For example, recently produced Signal communications show that days after Miss Lively commenced this action, defendants and Mr. Friedman were working with content creators to further their pro-Baldoni and anti-Lively campaign. That is how they represent things. Remember, the queen of misrepresentation. I was never told by anyone to write negative stories about Ku Klux Khaleesi. The shampoo company owner continues. On January 3rd, 2025, redacted. 2 days later, on January 5th, boom, redacted. A recording that was not produced, redacted. On January 7th, Miss Steele Sage Steele, a conservative influencer and client of Brian Friedman's, on January 7th, Miss Steele posted her carefully curated video from her official Talkie Tick account that covered, redacted, the amount of unnecessary redactions is just, and has garnered over 1.5 million views. In her video post, Miss Steele slams Miss Lively, accusing her of abusing her power and hurting other women, and claiming that Miss Lively's actions discredit other women that are true victims of SH. Signal communications from February 1st, 2025, which were produced by third party the Skyline Agency, also show defendants working with Mr. Friedman, his law firm, and Skyline to launch a website that would post communications between Miss Lively and Mr. Baldoni in relation to the ongoing litigation. In one Signal thread dated February 1st, redacted, the handful of Signal communications and voice memos that were produced by Skyline during this period demonstrate, redacted. Skyline's production not only demonstrates, redacted. Despite this, not one defendant, including the Wallace defendants, has produced a single voice memo from Mr. Wallace prior to December 20th, 2024, during their implementation of the digital campaign. Defendants admit that they anticipated litigation by August 2024, and in their verified interrogatory responses, Mr. Baldoni, Mr. Heath, Mr. Sorowitz, Miss Nathan, Miss Abel, and Tag each redacted. It is clear, however, that they anticipated litigation even before then. Indeed, Wayfarer compiled a timeline of Miss Lively's alleged incidents in June, interviewed Tag as early as July 25th, after which time Tag created its August 2nd scenario planning document contemplating working with legal, and shortly thereafter retained street relations. And redacted, there is a footnote. Because Signal communications were not preserved, redacted. Still, not one defendant has produced a single Signal communication or, for Mr. Wallace, any voice memo that predate December 20th, 2024. That is because defendants redacted. Miss Nathan claims that she began preserving redacted. There's a footnote. Mr. Heath testified that redacted. Despite this admission, no such Signal communications have been produced. Mr. Sorowitz confirmed, redacted. Deposition of Justin Baldoni, Mr. Baldoni testified, redacted, discussing, redacted. Defendants' obstructive conduct in this litigation confirms that sanctions are appropriate. The facts discussed immediately above were only recently obtained by Miss Lively after overcoming substantial discovery hurdles created by defendants. Footnote: in addition to 5 discovery-related motions with third parties, Miss Lively had to file 7 separate motions to compel defendants' compliance with various discovery obligations. There is no dispute that each of the defendants used Signal as an ephemeral messaging platform to discuss issues related to this litigation. This court has already acknowledged as much. Miss Lively first requested these Signal communications on February 20th, 2025, and the parties thereafter explicitly agreed in the ESI protocol governing discovery to manually review Signal communications among any party to the action. Yet, for almost 6 months, defendants refused to produce any of them and forced Miss Lively to file repeated motions to compel. In response, the Wallace defendants admitted that because they did not disable Signal's auto-deletion feature, no responsive communications remained in their possession, custody, or control. The court accepted this representation in denying Miss Lively's motion on this score. The court ordered the Wayfarer defendants to produce Signal communications no later than September 8, 2025. Instead of complying, the Wayfarer defendants made an 11th-hour request for a 1-week extension to complete this production, which this court denied for failure to demonstrate good cause. Ignoring the court's order, the Wayfarer defendants engaged in self-help and produced just a handful of Signal communications late. Footnote, on September 8th at 11:56 p.m. Eastern, certain Wayfarer defendants produced some Signal communications, totaling only 7 unique messages, which were buried in an 80,000-page document dump and were not even accessible until days later. And then their request for sanctions continues, unilaterally continued to produce more at random intervals with no explanation for another month until October 9th, pretty recently. Critically, however, none of the Signal communications predate December 20th. The Wayfarer defendants have established a clear pattern of failing to comply with their discovery obligations and this court's orders. That's a fair assessment. But the judge was on her side. Biased. The Wayfarer defendants also have not produced a compliant privilege log for all withheld Signal communications, which will, again, require further motion practice. Furthermore, inexplicably, Mr. Heath, Mr. Wallace, and Miss Abel have not produced any of the Signal communications that were produced by Skyline, documents that were improperly withheld for privilege by Skyline and produced only after an order from this court. Nor have defendants produced any other Signal communications or, for Mr. Wallace, any voice memo that predate December 20th, 2024, including in the August through December timeframe, when they were actively discussing, among other things, an offensive strategy to protect Mr. Baldoni and Wayfarer's reputation and to bury Miss Lively. Communications that strike at the very heart of this case. Then they give the legal standard. We don't need to go over that. Summation, very briefly. Under Rule 37E, a party may be sanctioned if electronically stored information that should have been preserved in the anticipation or conduct of litigation is lost because a party failed to take reasonable steps to preserve it, and it cannot be restored or replaced through additional discovery. Okay. Therefore, defendants intentionally violated their duty to preserve ephemeral communications. They argue the duty to preserve ephemeral messages was triggered no later than August 2024 and as early as November 2023. It is well settled that a duty to preserve is triggered when a party receives a demand letter. Here, based on the service of the protections document, the return to work document, Wayfarer, It Ends With Us movie, and their principals had a duty to preserve beginning on November 9th, 2023. The same is true for Miss Abel. Redacted. As explained in the transmittal email issued by Miss Lively's counsel, the protections document outlined a list of protections that will need to be guaranteed and observed by the film's producers. One such protection included prohibiting retaliation of any kind, including during publicity and promotional work. Further, Miss Lively's counsel included a customary warning that if the production is unwilling to accept or uphold these protections, our client is prepared to pursue her full legal rights and remedies. There can be no dispute that this letter put Wayfarer, It Ends With Us movie, their principals, and Miss Abel on notice of Miss Lively's forthcoming suit. Redacted. At the latest, each Wayfarer defendant acknowledges redacted. Indeed, it was at this point that Wayfarer made the strategic decision to redacted with Miss Lively. Also, the tag defendants similarly do not dispute that litigation relating to the film was anticipated by August 2024, although, as noted above, Miss Abel redacted. This is consistent with the tag defendant's plan to lawyer up and to get ready for redacted. Oh my God, so ridiculous. I think that word is war. Why redact that? With Miss Lively. For their part, the Wallace defendants were aware of the protections document and thereby Miss Lively's underlying allegations, as well as the provision explicitly prohibiting retaliation when they were onboarded in early August 2024 to support Tag's offensive. Defendants failed to preserve ephemeral messages. Defendants took no affirmative steps to preserve their ephemeral messages. They did just the opposite. At a critical moment, they elected to communicate primarily through Signal, which they knew full well would automatically delete their messages, and took no steps to ensure that their messages would be preserved. It is no answer that the Tag and Wallace defendants appear to have used ephemeral messaging as a part of their regular business practice, because settled law requires a party to suspend auto-deletion of ephemeral features upon anticipating litigation. Courts have issued spoliation sanctions, whereas here, the parties, upon anticipating litigation, began communicating through Signal to avoid preserving responsive communications. Because defendants have done the same here, spoliation sanctions are warranted. Plus, the ephemeral messages are lost and cannot be replaced. It is beyond dispute that the ephemeral messages, i.e. the Signal communications and voice memos at issue here, are lost and incapable of being retrieved. The court previously acknowledged as much in denying Miss Lively's prior motion to compel the Wallace parties to produce all Signal communications. Accordingly, because there is no cognizable way to obtain these ephemeral communications, this final element for spoliation is met. Additionally, defendants intentionally used ephemeral communications to execute their plans in an untraceable manner without fingerprints. The decision to use ephemeral communications was deliberate and intentional to prevent documentary evidence of their social manipulation plan from falling into the wrong hands. Whether those hands belonged to Miss Lively, anyone sympathetic to her, or the court. Courts in this circuit have held that intent under Rule 37E2 can be demonstrated, whereas here the defendants knew they had a duty to preserve and allowed the original data on the event recorder to be overwritten and destroyed or recycled without ever confirming that the data had been preserved in another repository. By November 2023, and no later than August 2024, Wayfarer, It Ends With Us movie, their principals, and Miss Abel anticipated litigation. redacted. And Mr. Heath, Mr. Baldoni, Miss Abel, and Mr. Sarwitz's verified interrogatory responses, redacted. The same is true for the tag defendants, redacted. And while the Wallace defendants did not provide similar interrogatory responses, they were onboarded in August 2024 and retained as part of Mr. Baldoni and Wayfarer's offensive efforts to discredit Miss Lively in the event her allegations became public. Despite being admittedly aware that litigation was on the horizon, defendants elected to communicate through signal and voice memos, and possibly other ephemeral means. That is because an integral part of their plan was to execute their mission without leaving fingerprints or a trace. In fact, deposition testimony confirms, redacted. Worst of all, as early as August 2024, Mr. Friedman, their lawyer, was aware of defendants' use of Signal, as evidenced by the fact that he was included on Signal threads and did nothing to ensure the ongoing preservation of these communications. Instead, recently produced communications confirm that Mr. Friedman was not only a participant on Signal at relevant times, but even after the lawsuit was brought, he was directly involved in, redacted. Taken together, these actions more than meet the requisite level of intent. Miss Lively has been severely prejudiced by defendants' failure to preserve relevant communications. The prejudice to Miss Lively is obvious. Among other things, defendants failed to preserve more than 4 months' worth of communications from a platform that it is undisputed that the Wayfarer defendants used to discuss topics relevant to this litigation. This, in turn, has impaired Miss Lively's ability to fully prosecute her claims and to rebut defendants' defenses, particularly defendants' widely publicized claim that the Wallace defendants decided, after being retained, that no proactive digital campaign work was required given organic online sentiment, and redacted. In addition, Miss Lively has suffered economic prejudice based on the time and expense incurred to prove the use and disappearance of defendants' Signal messages and voice memos, as evidenced by the many motions to compel that Miss Lively was forced to file. The willful destruction of evidence warrants severe sanctions based upon defendants' willful misconduct, intentionally utilizing ephemeral messaging, and, as to Mr. Wallace, self-deleting voice memos to avoid the production of relevant communications, and the prejudice caused to Miss Lively as a result. Relief under Rule 37E2 is warranted. An appropriate sanction under Rule 37E should 1. Deter parties from engaging in spoliation, 2. Place the risk of an erroneous judgment on the party who wrongfully created the risk, and 3. Restore the prejudiced party to the same position he would have been in absent the wrongful destruction of evidence by the opposing party. Because defendants acted culpably in failing to preserve relevant communications, an adverse inference instruction is warranted to remedy the prejudice to Miss Lively in pursuing her claims. Accordingly, to remedy the prejudice caused by the spoliated evidence, Miss Lively respectfully seeks the following adverse inference. An adverse inference is a negative conclusion drawn by a court, jury, or tribunal against a party for failing to provide evidence that it controls or is expected to have. As a result of that, she wants an acknowledgement, a conclusion that defendants intentionally deleted and failed to preserve relevant evidence for this litigation. Defendants anticipated litigation with Miss Lively by at least August 2024, but nonetheless elected to use Methods of communication that automatically delete, such as Signal and as to the Wallace defendants' voice memos to discuss the execution of the digital campaign against Miss Lively, and defendants failed to take affirmative steps to preserve such communications prior to December 20th, 2024. You may presume from defendants' failure to preserve these Signal communications and voice memos that defendants did, in fact, execute the plan that TAG recommended and for which the Wayfarer parties retained the Wallace defendants, and that the defendants intentionally failed to preserve their communications in order to hide this fact. Allegation, I say. The trial is happening now. As I said at the beginning, we don't need the jury. The trial is happening now. In addition, Ridicula continues, the court should issue sanctions precluding defendants from asserting that they did not execute the digital campaign to develop a negative narrative about Miss Lively. Alternatively, Miss Lively should be permitted to present evidence and argument to the jury regarding the lost documents and seek a curative instruction under Rule 37E1 based upon the instruction proposed above, with the exception of the adverse instruction. With respect to the Wallace defendants, the court should further order an adverse inference that the Wallace defendants possessed the requisite knowledge of their co-conspirators in forum actions to support a finding of personal jurisdiction. Oh, she's still trying to keep Jed Wallace sucked into all this mess. Support a finding of personal jurisdiction, and that the Wallace defendants independently understood that their actions would have the requisite consequences in New York under CPLR 302A3. As is well established, evidentiary sanctions may supply the basis for a finding of personal jurisdiction, whereas here the sanctions are consistent with the Hammond-Packing presumption, namely the presumption that the refusal to produce evidence was but an admission of the want of merit in the asserted defense. This seems very sneaky to me. This is a request for sanctions, not a request to keep Jed Wallace in and to prove jurisdiction. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Ridicula is living up to their name. At a minimum, the court should order a permissive adverse inference and leave the issue for trial. Finally, defendants should be penalized with monetary sanctions and ordered to repay Miss Lively for the reasonable attorney's fees and costs for bringing this motion. Conclusion. For the above reasons, Miss Lively respectfully requests that her motion for spoliation sanctions be granted in its entirety. All right, because I'm Team Truth, I will say that this request, to me, seems a lot stronger than her request for sanction under that California law, 47.1, the one that was meant to protect real victims of SH, that new law. What do you think? Does she have a case here with this request? Will the judge grant it? Should he grant it? A lot to consider, and please also consider checking out my website every day throughout the day to stay informed and entertained. It's myname.com, P to the E to the R to the E to the Z to the H to the I to the L to the T to the O to the N.com. Also, I've got a lot of merch. I've got Team Truth. I've got Grab Your Friends, Wear Your Florals, and more. Check it all out at buypopstuff.com. That's buypopstuff.com. And making personalized videos for you all brings such a smile to my face. Book one right now on the Cameo website from me. I've got thousands of glowing reviews. Get one at cameo.com/myname. And finally, if you like my podcast, sign up for our Patreon and get an exclusive episode a week. Sign up today at patreon.com/myname. If you watched until the end, you are the 1%, you are the VIP. Say spoil in the comments section. Spoil in the comments section. Hit that like button, share this video, and This was a lot to take in. Thoughts? Credible claims? Credible arguments? What will the outcome be? A lot to chit-chat about. Let's do it all. You know where. And say spoil. Thank you for watching. Spoil. See you there.